Hello and welcome to the Acoustic Words Reading Room. For the next half hour, I hope to give you a chance to just get away from life for a little bit. I'll be reading some of my short fiction and poetry. I'm going to start with a poem. I know a lot of people, when they hear poem, tend to panic a bit. I try to avoid the really simplistic type of poetry. But I don't like to get esoteric and cerebral. And I realize that just by using the terms esoteric and cerebral, I probably just contradicted myself. But be that as it may, I try to keep it fairly simple. This poem is based on a book that I'd read by Jonathan Kozol discussing the education system in South Bronx and New York City back in the 90s. And it reflects a small park that was used as just an unofficial park that was a safe spot for the children in that area. This is called Children's Park, South Bronx. 1. There is a city where the tenements, like mountains, dominate the land and claw at heaven, and where the streets, like rivers, run black, brown, yellow, and swirl with life and death, and where the children, like butterflies, float on shy wings and then falter or lie crushed and broken. And there is a valley where the tenement mountains loom dark and angry and shoulder aside the poisonous sky, and where the street rivers gather in a backwater eddy and deposit their burdens of trash and treasure, and where the children, butterflies, struggle for light and warmth at the feet of beasts and monsters. 2. A once-upon-a-time garden grew in this valley, and a tree where bears, soft and small, climbed, dangled, smiled upon butterflies and beasts and monsters, and gave love and happily ever after promises, and took nothing but rain and snow and wind and sometimes sun. 3. The soft, small bears watched and smiled. The butterflies bludgeon the darkness with delicate beauty, see only sparkling waters and dancing leaves and God, and chide the grim mountains with crystal laughter. And then one day their sparkling eyes darken, and their dancing wings are stilled, and their feet are chained to the mountains, and they see another God, and their beauty is forever scarred. The climbing bears watched and smiled. The beasts were once butterflies, until they saw the scowling mountains and torn sky and fouled rivers, and turned to the monsters for help, and gave up freedom to gain escape. And now they shuffle and creep with torn wings to the feet of the monsters who bring them a god of slavery. The dangling bears watched and smiled. The monsters were once beasts, were once butterflies, until the slave god told them that slow, hazy death, vein-burning death, sweet, heart-crushing, brain-popping death would bring them gold and free them from the valley, river, mountains. And then the god of slavery and lies ripped their wings off completely and sent them in chains to sell death to the beasts. And all the time, the soft, small, climbing, dangling bears smiled as they watched, for they saw the beasts and the monsters taking care not to hurt the butterflies, and they knew that the beasts and the monsters were still butterflies, somewhere heart-deep, soul-deep. 4. There is a city, there is a valley, there are mountains and rivers, but the once-upon-a-time garden has been taken away, along with the tree and the soft, small bears and the happily ever after promises. But the monsters are still there, and the beasts and the butterflies, and the god of slavery and lies is still there, with his promises and chains. And another God is still there too, heart deep, soul deep. If only the monsters and beasts would look with sparkling butterfly eyes, they might find their wings once again. That was Children's Park, South Bronx. In my book, Acoustic Words, the collected short works, I divide my short stories into three parts. The first group I've titled sorry, the first group I have titled Speculative Fiction and Fantasy. The second group, Psychological Fiction. And the third group, Mainstream Fiction. This short story, Dance, comes from the psychological fiction. Now, I realize that for a lot of people, psychological has as much terror as poetry. Once again, I try not to get really deep and hard to understand. And actually, this is one of my best received stories. And this is called Dance. It doesn't really matter what city it was. It was Seattle, perhaps, or Phoenix, maybe Chicago, or Atlanta, or Miami, or, yes, even New York. It was large, whatever name it went by, as was the plaza at the feet of the high-rise office buildings in the midst of that city, although the sculptures, the fountain, and the potted trees tried to impose intimacy on it. Theirs was a gentle, touching failure, with a certain beauty of its own, not completely lost on those entombed in the surrounding buildings. On nice days, they would come forth, their computer paper winding sheets laid neatly on their desks, carrying their lunches and their hungers to borrow what life they could from the plaza. The plaza attracted the crowds, and both attracted the street entertainers to delight those who had already suffered 4 hours of their own entertainment and were confronting the bleak landscape of another 4. Sometimes a street theater staged a scene or two. Sometimes a juggler whirled odds and ends borrowed from purses and pockets. Sometimes mimes and white, startled faces told silent stories. And once a poet cried love and death and the ozone layer in free verse from the depths of his soul and the base of a squat, ugly metal Picasso. But it was mostly musicians who threaded the urban canyons and the traffic to this concrete stage. A solitary saxophonist standing beneath a drooping sycamore translating its pathos into sighs and sobs of melody. A string quartet from a nearby conservatory slipping in a little Bartók and Mozart between the egg salad sandwiches. A group of 19 and 20-year-olds feeling the pressure of age as they sought the big break, and still trying to decide whether to play classic rock or hip-hop. All these and more came with their own hungers for expression and recognition and whatever spare change might float their way. One particularly fine fall day, when the cool breeze had blown the haze and smog to the west and allowed the warm sun to shine through unfiltered, the pale noontime crowd found a percussion ensemble already playing by the fountain when they emerged. The variety of performers, young, old, black, white, brown, male, female, was matched by the variety of their instruments. A few were immediately recognizable, the congas and the tambourines, the claves and maracas and chimes. Others, such as the steel drums or the small gamelan, were identifiable only by some. But many were known only to those who had studied the smaller cultures of South America or Jamaica or Africa or Indonesia. The rhythms and permutations had seen other suns as well, and the snatches of melody were as exotic as the instruments from which they emerged. And all was played against the visual and aural backdrop of the fountain, the hiss of the water weaving into the tapestry of the music, the flashing droplets merging with the flicker of brass and copper and steel, until the audience stood swaying almost imperceptibly and chewing in time to the mesmerizing pulse. The young man standing atop the low Miro mosaic-tiled wall was, at first, unnoticed. No one had marked his arrival, although he certainly had not been there when they first gathered. But now heads and eyes were turning from the percussionists to the figure beyond the fringe of the crowd, drawn by the electricity of his immobility. He stood, but not at rest. He crouched slightly, his knees bent, one foot a little ahead of the other. His black pants stretched tight across his thickly muscled thighs. His long-sleeved black shirt clung to his wiry, tightly muscled torso. His arms hung by his sides, but not at ease. They were held a little away from his body, the hands curled into loose claws, one held an inch or two higher than the other. His gaunt, expressionless face was clean-shaven, his blue-black hair moderately short and brushed back. The shadows between his high, sharp cheekbones and his deep-set black eyes could have been artificially applied, but weren't. Against all this darkness, his pale skin gleamed like the midnight moon. He stood as if a part of the mosaic wall and the sculptures, unblinking, his gaze fixed somewhere above the crowd, until the percussionists paused. Well, not so much a pause, actually. It was a gasp, a startled break in the rhythm, but not in the sound. From somewhere among the musicians rose a piercing, bloodless, wordless cry. It sliced through the clatter of echoed percussion and splatter of falling water, seizing the breath from the jaws of the listeners, snapping their heads around. But before anyone could focus on those by the fountain, even as their heads were twisting to the front, a visual explosion pulled their eyes back to the mosaic. The black-clad figure leapt from the wall. His feet were bare. Those closest to him could see them later as in a photograph, a frozen instant in their memories. They were long and slender, incredibly delicate-looking, yet with thick yellow calluses dark against the blue-veined marble of the upper skin. They were beautiful, and those who saw them most clearly bit their lips as those beautiful feet struck the pavement. The crash of drums that accompanied the meeting of flesh and concrete made the watchers wince, as though the graceful arches and ankles themselves had shattered. Then the feet began moving in white, blurry streaks as the percussionists took up the jungle rhythms again. The pulse of the music became barbaric. It seized the young man and whirled and threw him across the plaza. He jerked back and forth, arms and legs thrusting, scything the air, pressing against the crowd, now there, now here. His fever heat drove them back until they formed a wide arch, its ends anchored a dozen feet from the fountain. Within this arena he danced his wild bacchanal, his body slung like a puppet, wielded by a child in the throes of a tantrum. He danced in a passion, but without fire. For his face remained empty, his lips held rigidly apart just far enough to allow his breath to hiss through. There was neither anger nor joy, desire nor despair in his eyes, and his watchers wanted to pull away from his icy violence. But the hypnotic savagery of the music and the dance held them in an unbreakable grip, and they trembled as they watched. Then, suddenly, the volume dropped, and the instruments returned to their opening motif, once again mingling with the unceasing melody of the fountain. The dancer came to rest in a perfect echo of his opening stance atop the wall. He stared at the crowd, and they stared back, and both panted, though not for the same reasons. And then, with slow, jerking steps, he advanced. The blankness of his face had not changed, and yet it was transformed. For although the rest of his features remained as lifeless and cold as the buildings that now seemed to stifle the plaza, his eyes had awakened and now reached out in hunger as he slowly paced the perimeter of the arch, burning each face they touched, defiantly flinging raw emotion at these professional mannequins. And each watcher felt something stir in a carefully hidden place. For one, it was anger. For another, fear. For still another, desire. But from the dancer himself, the men felt only a contemptuous challenge, as though it were automatically assumed that the challenge would go unanswered, while the women felt only a compelling command to step forward, join the dance, and what? They didn't know. But they, like the men, pulled back, shivering. He started at the center of the arch and worked his way to one end, then crossed to the other. And when he had returned to the center, she was there. Her arrival, like his, had gone unmarked, although she must have slipped through the thickest part of the crowd. She stood just within the border of the arch, and when his eyes locked on her, he froze. His body was once again a near-perfect echo of his first position, This time, however, his right hand was extended to her. She smiled and stepped forward, the last fringe of people parting before her. Her left hand was extended to his right, but he retreated just before they met. She advanced, matching her languid, flowing steps to his taut, jerking ones. They reached the center of the arched arena, where they paused for the watchers to study her. She was a deep, rich black with red in its depths. Her hair, nearly as dark as her skin with flashes and sparks of that same red, was gathered tightly at the base of her skull, then allowed to spill luxuriously down her back, just past her waist. She was slender and as tightly muscled as he, but hers was the supple slenderness of a swan's neck to his lightning bolt sharpness. She wore a white leotard and a soft, loose white summer dress that swirled like the foam in the fountain. On her long, thin feet were soft, white slippers. Her body was like liquid, and her face was a dance in itself. They stood frozen in mid-pace. Then she began to sway back and forth, just a little at first, then a little more, until she was suddenly gliding across the concrete. The percussion line rippled and swirled with shimmering shivers of bell trees and wind chimes. She was a creature of the air, her existence a playful celebration. She was a leaf, plucked and joyfully spun to and fro. She was bound to the earth only by the technicality of gravity, for while her slippers regularly brushed the concrete, she seemed always to float just above it. She darted around the watching human arch, drawing the heart of now one, now another into her exultation. And then, as she passed in front of the young man who seemed somehow to have conjured her, he sprang once more to life. They moved together, yet separately, as the music changed again. Her long, sensuous line now wove its subtle way between his jarring syncopations. She dipped smoothly beneath his outthrust arm. He darted and leapt around her silken arabesques. She sketched caresses over him. He slashed and stabbed at her. Yet theirs was not a dance of anger and antagonism, but one of completion, for it soon became clear that each was echoing and responding to the other. His mad whirls were her arabesques given power. Her caresses were his thrusts given tenderness. Though she was as sensuous as he was mechanical, though he was as icy as she was passionate, they blended into a wrenching whole. Oh, they danced. They flung themselves at each other with reckless precision. They sent wave upon wave of raw energy crashing through the plaza, while the watchers struggled for each strangled breath and clutched their brown paper sacks in an effort not to drown. Black and white, white and black, they offered themselves to each other, inviting any and all to share their blazing intimacy without ever once touching each other. Every step, every twist of a hand, a shoulder, a hip, shouted an invitation to join them. But the freer their dance became, the more the onlookers felt their own feet sink into the pavement, the more they felt the iron links chaining their own hands to the concrete. Tears rose in many eyes, but even these were too heavy to spill over the rims. And still the dancers spun in ever-tightening circles, oblivious to all around them. The music grew more frantic. The yearning of the crowd swelled and deepened. All pressed inexorably towards some explosive release, and then it was over. As quickly and abruptly as that, it ended. The dancers slammed to a halt, motionless except for one final swirl of her dress and hair. The last echoes of the percussion faded into the splashing of the fountain, and the people were left feeling as though the ground had dropped away, taking their stomachs with it. They stood blinking, disoriented, staring at the dancers, waiting for something to happen. But the dancers did not stir. They stood within a finger's width of each other. His left foot was flat on the concrete, his right heel was raised. His entire body reached up, twisting slightly to the right, bending forward. His left arm was thrust behind him, his right was curved over and around her. She crouched, her right leg forward, her left stretched behind her. Her back was arched, Her left arm curved around his hip. Her right hand reached for his left. They still did not touch. But their faces were the most arresting part of the picture. He, whose features had been so lifeless, now stared at her with desperate desire, lips parted, eyes pleading. She, whose features had revealed her heart and soul, stared past him, her jaw clenched, her eyes cold and dead. The silence stretched as the audience slowly struggled out of their trance. A few hands were raised, but never met. Applause seemed wrong. The musicians quietly packed up their instruments, neither speaking to nor looking at one another. Still, the dancers stood, frozen. The crowd drifted apart. People looked at watches, murmured to one another, carried their half-eaten sandwiches and untouched desserts back into the buildings. Someone laughed, but it was quickly stifled. And still, the dancers stood. For the next 10 or 15 minutes, any who glanced out a window and down at the plaza could see the two dancers like a new sculpture, a study in black and white, a study in passion and ice. And for a moment, they would be back under the sun, the percussion pounding through their bodies, the yearning pulsing deeper than that. Many tried to ignore the tableau, but found themselves watching anyway as the dancers vanished and reappeared in the new crowds that hurried across the concrete to some other life. Then a particularly large group of Japanese businessmen on their way to a meeting engulfed the pair, and when the businessmen had vanished, so had the dancers. It took the rest of the day before those in the building could finally pass a window without glancing out and down. When they left for home, most were able to cross the plaza without a slight shiver. And the following noon, the audience greeted a surprised and grateful ventriloquist with extra loud laughter and prolonged applause. And that was dance. I'm going to conclude this reading session with another poem. Try to ignore the fact that a 68-year-old white male is reading this poem, because I want you to ask yourself 3 questions. First of all, what is the sex and age of the narrator? Secondly, what is the sex and age of the narrator's companion? And third, what is the relationship? What is the nature of their relationship? Just keep those 3 questions in mind. This is called October Ride. We set out on our journey with a rattle of chains and clatter of gears. You on your new 21-speed Italian racer, me on my beat-up, assembled in Ohio mountain bike. Pointed, squinting at the sun, we move slowly, fighting the wind at our backs, drinking the cool morning wine through our pores. I grin at you. Your spokes and teeth wink back. The corners of your eyes laugh as your tires whisper endearments to the pavement. We talk easily, our words whirling behind us to fall lightly on the grass and melt with the dew. You pull a stream of sunlight from your water bottle. It splashes over your chin and down your throat, each trembling drop carrying my smile. Your long, sweet legs reach out and reel in, reach out and reel in, tugging at my breath with every crook of your knee, bend of your ankle. Your skin glistens and glows faintly, while cold drops trickle down my back and chest and return shivers in their place. I shut my mind to them and lick my lips and taste sweet tang and salt. It makes me think of seaside days and fireside nights and you. Silent now, we skirt a small, still pond, the surface unruffled by the knowledge of our passing. We strain together against the hills and coast with them and lean into one another on the curves. A solitary car passes. I drop behind you. Your scent teases me with musk and pine and delicate sweat. We move faster. The muscles of your back are taut with joy. I feel the strain of keeping up with you. We pump in ragged rhythm. I, not quite able to match your pace, fall behind, move ahead. The tinted leaves of summer's picnics and rain walks lie scattered behind us, not yet brown, stirred to brief life by our breeze. You offer me your grin. My heart shrinks from your laughter, but your eyes hold no guile. Your gift surges through my body, carrying your joy to my own muscles. My breath catches in my chest. I envy your easy inhale-exhale, the smooth, dashing pulse in your throat, even each sparkling drop that clings to your cheek. We plunge into green, flickering tunnels. Your body, unafraid, perhaps uncaring, slices cleanly through shadows that cling cold and slimy to my own skin. Back under the sun, we mount one last hill, round one last curve to see our goal ahead. I coax my burning legs and lungs to one last burst of desperation. You look startled as I pull away from you. I coast to a stop, trembling, triumphant, and look back. You roll gently up beside me with a small, secret smile. And that was October Ride. Once again, the three questions. What are the sex and age of the narrator? What are the sex and age of the narrator's companion? And what is the nature of their relationship? If you'd like to, you can post answers to those three questions in the comments below. Also, if you'd like to, go ahead and there should be a button somewhere nearby that says subscribe. You can go ahead and click on that. And if you'd like hard copies of the short stories and the poems, the short stories are available in electronic downloads for Nook or Kindle by way of Barnes & Noble and Amazon. And the short stories and poems are all collected in a hardcover edition as well as an electronic edition. And it is called Acoustic Words, Collected Short Works by Stephen M. Larson. The short stories on one of the poems are accompanied by original drawings, and each of the stories and poems also includes a little bit of description behind the scenes of how they came to be written. And that will conclude for this particular reading room. Please join me again for another short story and possibly, depending on how long the story is, more poetry. Thank you. Have a great day.